Blimey, the country is in a right old mess. I mean, honestly, I don't want to sound like one of these, oh, the country's gone to the dogs, but the country has gone to the dogs. The Conservatives have plunged this country into an absolute show. Gonna cut out the swear word there, but you know what I'm saying. Why am I saying this? Well, I don't want to sound bitter, heaven forbid, but the Conservative Party made a decision during the last general election campaign. Do you remember that campaign? I still wake up in cold sweats thinking about that campaign. And they made a decision to say that basically a Labour government would unleash chaos. It would be an absolute disaster. It would imperil our country. So I put the tweet, you might remember in the interview I did with Ed Miliband, that David Cameron wrote on the eve of the last general election. I mean, it's just gotta laugh. Imagine the calamity that would have befallen this nation if the Conservatives had lost the general election. Thank God we've got stability. You can't walk for stability. We've got stability coming out of our ears at the moment. It's so boring and stable, Britain, at the moment. So where are we at as a country? Well, we're more bitterly divided than at any point since World War II. That's a bit of a downer. Scotland's on the verge of seceding. The Northern Ireland peace process is at risk. We're increasingly isolated with our nearest neighbours who are increasingly fed up with us and have very little incentive to give us a good deal. Plus the fact we're now heading apparently to a hard Brexit, which will turn us into some sort of weird tax haven with basic social provision ripped away. Having gone through the longest fall in wages for workers since the 19th century, they're about to start falling again, which will mean the longest squeeze in wages since Emperor Napoleon, the Emperor of the French, at the beginning of the 19th century. Do you remember David Cameron back in the day? Cuddly, poncing around the Arctic with huskies, wanting to give hoodies a good old hug. And everyone was like, oh, he's a new liberal face of conservatism. Now, he came to power and decided to revise history about why this crisis enveloped Britain, that it was to do with spending on schools and hospitals. Tories backed every single penny of that spending, but history had to be revised.
The Conservatives will be spending the same as the Labour Party, although we hope to spend it a great deal better. Under a Conservative government, those services would not be cut. Indeed, the money would increase.
I'm not saying the anger and disillusionment of communities in this country was caused by the Cameroons. Under successive governments, under Thatcherism, where industries were trashed and the communities that depended on them suffered as a consequence, New Labour, despite some good things they did, failed to properly reverse a lot of that damage. So a lot of these communities were already feeling a bit like, you've screwed us over, we're not happy with you. And a lot of those communities, as we know, went on to vote for leave in the EU referendum, a sign of massive disenchantment, in large part, with how things were. And the cuts and the squeeze in living standards under Conservatives made their situation worse, and obviously made them even more likely, when they had a ballot paper which said, do you want to vote for the status quo or not, to vote leave. Now, David Cameron, of course, proposed an EU referendum, not because he thought, let's resolve this issue for the country's sake. He didn't think that. He just thought, oh, I've got these angry backbenchers nipping at my heels, better find some way of placating them, which he then did. He kept going on about how bad immigration was. He didn't talk about it in any positive way. It was a problem to be dealt with.
Net migration to this country will be in the order of tens of thousands each year, not the hundreds of thousands every year that we've seen over the last decade.
Guess what? Didn't come anywhere near his target. In fact, way over the target. And that had the worst of both worlds, where he's saying immigration is a bad thing. Immigration continues, in fact, increased in some periods of the time he was Prime Minister. And then lots of people were like, yeah, immigration's bad, but it's not going down despite their promises. That makes me even angrier with politicians and makes me want to punch them in the face even more, which they did. So David Cameron, he suggested that, you know, when he was negotiating with the EU before the referendum happened to get a deal to put to the public, and he was like,
no duff arguments, no pretending that Britain couldn't survive outside the EU. Of course we could.
And then, during the referendum, he basically said Armageddon would be unleashed, peace in Europe would be threatened, and all sorts of economically ruinous things would happen.
You will fundamentally damage our economy. We will be voting potentially for a recession, and you put a bomb under our economy.
If you swing from saying Britain will be fine outside the EU to the world will end, people might think, I don't really believe him. So because of all those miscalculations, Britain voted to get out of the EU.
David Cameron now claims Turkey won't join the EU, but that's not what he said before.
Because his colleagues in the Conservative Party made a tactical decision to wage an inflammatory xenophobic anti-immigration campaign, they stirred up huge tensions, they legitimised xenophobia and racism, so we've ended up with this angry, bitter, divided nation. People in Scotland voted against leaving the EU, and they've looked at all of this, the fact, Theresa May, who's not tried to placate Scotland, not tried to bring them on board, but instead basically gone, like it or lump it, you're leaving the EU, and it's going to be a hard Brexit, thank you very much, we're getting out the single market.
Brexit means Brexit.
Now, a lot of people in Scotland who voted against leaving are thinking, did I sign up for this? Not only are they stuck under a very right-wing government, which they don't elect, most Scots, but equally, they're going, didn't vote to leave the EU either, that we really want to stay in, now we're getting thrown even out the single market. So basically the very future of this country now is at stake.
I will now take the steps necessary to make sure that Scotland will have a choice at the end of this process. A choice of whether to follow the UK to a hard Brexit or to become an independent country.
In the last referendum campaign, support for independence was about 28% at the beginning of the referendum campaign. By the end of it, it was 45%. This time, some polling suggests 50% of Scots already support independence. What's going to happen as this right-wing Tory government continues? What's going to happen when it's clear we're heading for a hard Brexit or even no deal at all, turning this country into some tax haven with social provision decimated? Do you think the people of Scotland are going to go, sign me up? So we've got a situation where the Conservative and Unionist Party, to give them their full and correct title, are now, by the looks of things, heading towards, unless something changes, the dismantling of the union itself. What an absolute mess. I mean, it is a bit of a mess, isn't it? Not bad work for 2 years of David Cameron and Theresa May. Less than 2 years. We're not even at the anniversary of the general election. If that has been achieved in this space of time, what's going to happen in the next 2 years or so? I mean, it's ironic, isn't it? This whole kind of Toryism is often about Britain's in decline, we'll turn it around, we'll be great, without paraphrasing Donald Trump. But we're heading towards becoming this ever smaller, inward-looking nation with bigotry and xenophobia running rampant because of official sanction from much of the political and media elite. Whereas we're increasingly ostracised by our closest neighbours, instead we're going to go off and, hold hands with Donald Trump's United States of America. Is that really the kind of future we're looking forward to? A future of decline in every sense, of isolation, of bigotry, of the country falling apart? That is, I'm afraid, the Conservative promise. A Conservative party presiding over decline and stagnation, isolated in the world. I think there's got to be an alternative to that. So, am I being too pessimistic? Maybe the country has a great future. Maybe I'm being alarmist. Maybe I'm not being alarmist enough. Who knows? I want to hear what you think. How do we get out of this mess, this rut we're now in as a country with all these growing, ever more bitter divisions? How will history look back at this? I want to hear some proactive suggestions. Make me feel more cheerful. Cheer me up. This is Operation Cheer Me Up. Selfish. So leave your comments as ever below the line. Subscribe. I'll see you next time.